How are we doing today? We've talked about a whole lot of the basic building blocks and some basic constructs to get you moving around the fretboard and experimenting so you can focus on the basics that we've talked about so far are going to be some of the most important things that you're going to have to work with. Even some of the ones I talk about, really basic articulations that will develop into more advanced articulations, way to do them, and you may experiment with others. But it's the basics you need to worry about. And we talked about some basic ways of moving around in the fretboard and the most important concept of resolving. And you can use any of those tools moving around on the fretboard as long as you've got some idea of where you're going. And with what we've talked about so far and some of the abstract concepts as far as moving around the fretboard and resolving, that you should be starting getting a pretty good idea of, to get yourself moving forward, practicing. So at this point, I think that we're going to address an issue that can be directly related to a couple different topics. The first topic that it's going to be directly related to is going to be things like passing tones. Chords that are moving somewhere can be the same thing as what we talked about with passing tones. Passing tones that could be any notes, and even if they're not in scale or key, just as long as they're resolving somewhere and everybody else in the band or in the song, all the instruments are following along with it, and it sounds constant and good to you. Does that make sense? Because you're the one creating it, you're the one or the group creating it and improvising it or whatever. So the most important critique is going to become from you, the group, or you, the one that's writing it. But another really cool tool is going to be modal mixture and chordial mixture. Now, this concept basically is going to bring back to the concept we talked about, the scales that I think you should learn. But even with the most basic ones being the pentatonic scale, the blues scale, the 5 modes that go with each of those, and the major and minor scales, and the 7 modes that go with them, that you can still do a lot with this, and using the chords, the most basic chords we talked about, even the simple triads and harmonies. So the concept works like this, is I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible without getting this too technical, so that the basic concept, you can apply it and use it. And the basic concept is, with a modal mixture or chordial mixture like this, is using the same root tone to start from. So whether you're using a scale mixture, meaning overlaying different scales on top of each other, or a chordial mixture, meaning putting different chords on top of each other, is that they are going to have the same root. So, and this can develop into some very complex theory. So we're not going to go there. We just want to address the basic concept so that you can elaborate on it, so to speak. Meaning you can go take that in any direction you want, just as long as you understand the most basic concepts that we've talked about so far. When we're moving forward or resolving are going to be some of the most basic and fundamental things that are going to really help you get to whatever you're doing with this technique, is resolving it. Does that make sense? And or using the technique when developing passing tones, going in between stops in progressions. Does that make sense? When we talked about progressions, even something as basic as a 1-4-5. So let's address this simple concept. The simple concept, let's deal with it firstly of chordial mixture. You have, let's say we're playing on C, we're using C as the root, and we're making a C major chord. And we're improvising or writing something, we play a C major, and we take this is not going to be in any key, more than likely, but we're going to play an A minor there, after playing that. Now you feel that both of those, that's a chordial mixture type of technique, and it's what it's going to do. It could be any chord. You could go from major to a dominant 7th, or you could go from minor to a diminished seventh. Does that make sense? The concept is not important which chord you go to, is that you're using that root as the foundation as another chord. And it's a chordial mixture. So that concept's very simple to understand. And just keep in mind that as you're moving forward and you use that technique, that the biggest thing is going to be, is it sound consonant with what you're doing, and can you resolve it back into key or wherever you're going to make it sound like it has good resolve. That's a very simple concept to understand, and I'm trying to give, it may sound really basic the way I'm showing it to you, but it's a real simple concept. The next thing would be overlaying scales on top of chordial changes like that. Would be some type of modal mixture, and it can be any mode. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm playing C, and we talked about the first basic Ionian mode and its structure. So if I go in C and I play like the C major, and I do some kind of improvise on it, and then I switch to like the C minor seventh, and then I play a minor mode, the Aeolian mode, over it. Now this technique, the concept of this modal tonal mixture, laying them over each other, you get this cool kind of effect that's like, you can bounce that back and forth, and you can overlay any of those modes you want. Now the concept, the most basic concept of that is you'd be playing some type of scale that is tonally consonant with that chord. So if you were playing a major chord here, you could be playing the Ionian mode, you could be playing the Lydian mode, you could be playing the Mixolydian mode as an example, or the major pentatonic mode. Or if it was minor chord, you could be playing the Dorian mode, you could be playing the Phrygian mode or the Aeolian mode over that, or you could be playing the minor pentatonic over that. So there's, if that makes sense, because we've already talked about modes some and the basic tonal chords that go with each one of those modes. So that's a very simple concept. Or you can switch to like a more exotic chord, like a dominant seventh. You go from major. Does that make sense? To Does that make sense? Now, the example was really basic, but I used the same root and changed to different chords, and then I used the complementary scale, because I went to this diminished seventh, and then I played the diminished scale on top of it, and then I went back to the major chord. This whole concept can get very complicated, but I'm showing you some very simple examples so that the basic concept gets across to you. And even with pentatonics, you can do the same thing with like major scale, major chord, major pentatonic, to minor chord, minor pentatonic, back to major, or off to some other chord with that same root. Or you can mix them sometimes also. You could play the major chord and play the minor pentatonic scale over it. You hear that? It's kind of funky because it's basically a minor mode over a major chord, but you can make it work. One of the key things that you run into with dissonance with that is that sometimes it doesn't sound resolved. So like if you play like this minor chord and you play the major pentatonic over it, now it might sound resolved if you went to a major chord after it, or it might sound resolved if you took that, played that minor chord, played that major pentatonic first mode of the pentatonic scale, and you went back to one of the notes in the minor mode, like the minor scale or the minor, one of the minor modes or the minor pentatonic scale. Does that make sense? To try to help it resolve so it sounds somewhat consonant. That can be tricky and that takes practice. But the more you practice with it and play around it, you can do some really cool things with that. Because what it boils down to, the whole concept is that we talked about what music theory is about. And basically, it's a whole lot of basic constructs that you can start from or use as passing tones, trying to move around in your improvisations or your compositions. So those are the same concepts. Those modes and those chords are basic structures, and mixing them together a little bit can have some really cool effects. Sometimes you might play something like, you might try to mix one chord with another chord or with another scale, and it doesn't sound consonant, and the key will be trying to resolve back to some note that's going to make it sound consonant. We talked about resolve, so that can be a little tricky sometimes. Sometimes you might be playing another scale on top of a chord, and it doesn't sound quite right, but then you resolve it to some note that sounds consonant with it, or consonant to the following chord, or resolve it with the following chord. And we talked about resolve enough to where that should make sense to you. And like I said, that can get tricky, and sometimes it takes a little time. Sometimes it's not easy to do on the fly and during improvs and things like that. You know, but if you know it's coming and you wrote it that way, that you can do some really cool stuff. Sometimes that can be kind of hard just to improv around like that, because it may take a minute for you to figure out what note you can resolve back to. Or you go back to one of those tonal underlying chords that we talked about with resolve as a fail-safe. Does that make sense? That way you don't have to think about it too much at all. So it's a really cool concept to experiment with. And at this point, from what we've talked about, that it may sound like advanced theory, but it's really not. It's a basic building block, just like most of the rest of ones that you can use very simply and elegantly with taste. Or you can make this whole concept really strange and weird and outlandish, and mixing Indian, three-note scales with Indonesian, whatever. I don't know, and it's like I've talked to some people who have done this type of concept and tried to do this, that sometimes it gets a little wordy and it starts sounding like some really advanced theory. But the basic concept is very simple. Does that make sense? It's just like droning, like a very simple concept of you droning in E, and you're playing E, right? So if you're going to play an E, you could be messing around with, I don't know how many modes. If you're just, just vamping an E, I mean, there's how many modes that you could mess around with that changing. You'd have at least 3 modes from the major scale, the minor modes. You'd have the minor pentatonic scale. You'd have at least that to work with that you could mess around. So that give you an idea. You would also have the minor melodic mode, the melodic minor, the harmonic minor, the first mode of each of those. And so, I mean, there's quite a few options just right there that you could be vamping around on top of it if everything else is just droning in E. And that's a very simple, you experiment with that and you'll find it's very, how do I say that? It's an enlightening concept that opens up some doors. But basically what it boils down to is a whole lot of modal and chordial mixture that's just going to really depend on the resolve and your use of it. But it can be really fun. I mean, it can just be a lot of fun, using that tonal root and then overlaying scales, because it's very simple. Like the major scale, it's like the first part of the major scale. And you go to the harmonic scale. Now that's a real simple example. So with that concept, I'm trying to lay that out as simple as possible. So the whole modal and chordial mixture concept is very easy to understand. And I didn't get into a whole lot of advanced theory things that can happen with that. It's the basic concept that I want you to understand. That way, if you're writing some things to improvise or you're composing, that you understand that's a very useful tool, and it can open up a lot of things. You switching from using different modes of different scales on different chords, you know, and experimenting around, even with the basic ones that we initially talked about, being the pentatonic, the blues scale, the 5 modes that go with those. We talked about the major and minor scale and the 7 modes that go with those. And, you know, some other things like the basic chords that we've talked about, just the basic ones that we addressed. Even with that, that can open up worlds of possibilities for you to experiment around in your composition. And with the other scales that I advised you to learn, that it opens up a world of possibilities to use to move around the fretboard, to move around in your improvisations, and to move around in your compositions. So peace, hope, love. I hope I made that concept really easy to understand so that you can get in a little bit of a modal and chordial mixture and have some fun playing the guitar and working on you. Peace, hope, love. See you in the next video.